We'll begin with our session 2, which is on food and agriculture, trade and competition. I would request the panelists to kindly come on stage to moderate the session. The first panelist we have is Mr. Bonikel, former chairperson, South Africa Competition Commission. Mr. Mahmoud Mumtaz, Competition Enforcement and Food Sector, Chairman, Egyptian Competition Authority. Mr. Andrei, dealing with competition concerns in the food and agriculture sector in Russia, Deputy Head, Federal Anti-Monopoly Services, Russia. Then we have Mr. Alexei, Causes and Consequences of Price Volatility in Global Food Markets, Director, BRICS Competition Law and Policy Center. Miss Dinah, Industrial Policy, Competition and Trade in Food and Agriculture, Associate Professor, Sciences, Law School. Mr. Sachin Kumar Sharma, Agriculture Subsidies and Trade Distortion, Associate Professor, Center for WTO Studies. And finally, we have Mr. Claudio, Competition Policy and Global Food Value Chain, Lecturer, School of Law, University of Aberdeen. He'll be joining us virtually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening. The panel has been introduced. I've been introduced. Thanks very much for inviting us. We are doing the last panel of the day, probably the most important, dealing with food, the most, the base of in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Ladies and gentlemen, are you hungry? Let's get this done because there's food after this food panel. I think I want to start this by acknowledging the work that was done by the BRICS competition authorities. I think we did a study on food value chains, published 2018, I think, and 2017. Really behind the work of the authorities was the BRICS Competition Center. Alexei, I think there was also Yanis Ilianos who was involved in that. Really a comprehensive kind of study of the challenges in the value chain, especially focusing on the role that competition policy could play in these socially sensitive markets. What happened since then? Well, we've had COVID, I think, is the biggest global issue, which did impact on availability of food, affordability of food. In South Africa, at least, I don't know about many other countries, we had the rich buying out all the food in anticipation of the lockdowns, and there was a need to intervene and start kind of food rationing and not allowing people to buy everything because they could not afford, and others left with nothing. We've also seen after that, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine, which has directly impacted on food prices, with grain being most affected. We've also seen some effect that is still raging of food inflation. I don't know now, we know exactly where this comes from. It's quite persistent. Probably some of the factors I've mentioned are still at play. But we are in a very unusual situation. When we went to I used to be the vice chair of the ICN, and I got a sense that my colleagues at the ICN were more concerned about energy prices than anything else. And I always lamented the fact that, you know, the developed world doesn't want to discuss food prices, probably because there is enough food, I don't know, or people can afford. Even now, if this was a debate in the OECD, it probably would be, the most burning topic would be energy crisis. And I'm not saying energy is not important for developing for the developing world. I'm very glad that Katz has put this topic forward as one of the keywords. So, and I've got an outstanding panel to discuss this. I must not take much of their time. I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that I go to the order of what appears in the program. And if you want more time, and I would love to have a debate, we could maybe have 5 minutes for a start, because if you want to take your 10 minutes now, you could do that. But I think it would be nice if you take 5 minutes so that we have a little bit of a debate in the end. So when you start speaking, you must say 5 or 10, depending on whether you want to come back. Mahmoud, I'm going to start with you. Of course, Egypt it does grow food on its own, but we also know that it's heavily dependent on imports. It's a desert, after all, most of it. Uh, how has how have things panned out in Egypt, and most importantly, how has this affected the competition authority?
Oh, thank you so much, Tembi. I think I want to come back, so I'll take only 5 minutes. So, talking about food, as you've mentioned, Egypt is considered, I think, the first importer of wheat worldwide, and hence, food for Egyptians, as you've mentioned, is the basic essential. And hence, we, as in the competition agency, we took several approaches to look into that matter. As I've mentioned earlier, into our strategy, we work on two pillars. One on competition enforcement, and here we build up a new tool, which is monitoring food prices, which is basically a price crawling tool, which grabs the information from different retailers' websites of specific essential foods that we pre-decided about it. And then here we can see if these food prices are moving into the right direction or not. And hence this economic intelligence here that we have reports to the enforcement department. In the enforcement department, what we took an approach which basically we screen the value chain as a whole. So we started from we had a case recently in regards to potato seeds. Egypt is one of the main exporters of potatoes worldwide. And here we found out an abuse of dominance case in the wheat potatoes. Also, we found out cartel in the fertilizers markets, one into the production and another one into the distribution of fertilizers. So, and then afterwards we moved down to the chain to look into the food price itself. But as many of our of competition agencies worldwide, the informality of markets makes it harder when you go down the chain. And hence we also looking currently into several cases. One of bid rigging case that might be published soon, and another one also in the food market that we're going to be entering for a decision to the board. So that's on that side. On the other side is basically how to make markets more competitive, and here we look into the legislations and the decrees of that manages the food sector, starting from the importing or growing or distribution and so on. Hence, to find out the bottlenecks, and identifying the bottlenecks would enhance the market structure, market dynamics to take place, and hence we can see lowering of prices. What also we've seen in the recent years, I would say, greedflation, which is became more precisely. In another case, we found out that the overcharges of certain goods went up to 80%. As I recall, in Connor 2014 famous paper of overcharges, he was saying that cartels goes up to 30% and bid rigging up to 50% maximum. So now I claim that there is another number even in the price overcharges. So that's in brief what we've been doing on that side. And I'll stop here and then maybe I'll come back to have the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to come back to use this interesting issues, and I think it would be good to also hear how this has impacted on your major regulation and how you use that instrument in addition to what you have mentioned. Let's move now to another question, agency. Andre, France has been quite active in putting a spotlight on socially sensitive markets. I have read that Russia has experienced inflation. I think at some point you even put a stop to wheat exports, affecting everyone else. Can you please share with us your experience with this?
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to take part in this session for me. And talking about the our national experience from the point of view of law enforcement and advocacy of competition, we use some instruments and mechanisms. They are following. First of all, of course, it's anti-monopoly regulation. But talking about anti-monopoly regulation from the point of view of abuse of dominance or cartel cases, it's quite difficult to use the traditional instruments of enforcement on the food and agro markets, because these markets in Russia are low concentrated ones. And on the most of this market, it's impossible to find the dominant company on the national level, and it's difficult to find the dominant companies on the local markets as well. Maybe the only examples are milk industry or maybe something else. But generally, it is countrywide markets with very wide boundaries, and the level of concentration is quite low to enforce the competition legislation. But what could we do in this situation? We start to use widely the ways of soft law tools implementation, such as issuing the warnings to the market participants that were signaling about price rising, such as developing the ideas of self-regulation of market participants on the base of socially responsible behavior. And yes, it works. It works even on low concentrated market. It helps us to have the prices stable. Because, for instance, many Russian fertilizers companies, as well as producers of some agricultural commodities, as well as retail chains, make some steps for socially responsible behavior and try to minimize their markups, and it leads to affordability of food for all Russian citizens. One more very important way of development of competition and stabilizing on the markets is the development of commodity exchange. Of course, first steps for development of commodity exchange trade were oil, gas, and coal, and some other commodities. But now we started to trade on the retail on the commodity exchange, such commodities as sugar, wheat, vegetable oil, and so on and so forth. And it's very important for stabilizing the prices to guarantee the normal trading process and to stabilize the value chains in the sector, as well as to rate the national price indicators for these commodities. That is very important for the general stabilization of situation on the market as well. And I stop here because I want to talk about some other things. Yes.
Okay. I'm happy to do that. I'm going to take you off script a little bit when you come back. I want you to share with us whether the sanctions against Russia have had any impact all on this. How do you see that? You'll come back. I think it's Alexei next. He's got some slides. You're going to take your 5 minutes or your 10 minutes?
Can I do a compromise? Take 8? And then a slide comment at the end?
Yeah.
Just 3 one, yeah. I will try to be very quick, although I have plenty of slides, but I will skip them quickly. I don't have a plate now, so shall I say like next slide, next slide? Okay, so I will start talking. So my presentation is actually about one of the elements of the global value chain, which is essentially trading. And I think trading is important because of one very simple thing. So there is like concilium over there. So I got a clicker. Very nice. Thank you very much. And I have presentation now. Life gets better and better every second. So why it's important? Once again, why it's important? Doesn't work. Where shall I? Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Why it's important? Actually, the world we live in, it's quite particular. We eat a lot of stuff, but actually where we get our calories is from essentially 3 grains. And those grains, wheat, rice, and corn, they cover up to 90% of all calories humans consume. Next slide, please. Yep. And the world actually getting more and more dependent on what is global trade. It's quite a unique situation actually. Back in the days, we were growing our food, and for instance, in Egypt, people were growing to the new, delta, how do you call it, the area, and then somehow because of the growth population, but more importantly, because of the change of the global landscape, the legal, economical landscape, people became much more dependent on the trade in food. And with growth population twofold, food trade increased like 6-fold, which is actually quite faster than growth in population. Next slide, please. Take, for instance, Middle East, and Egypt was mentioned, and who was presenting in the beginning of this session. Egypt is becoming more and more dependent on importation, not only because of climate change and things like this, but also because of easiness to go into the global market, because mechanisms developed by traders and by the system actually allows countries like Egypt, which are dependent on the importation, get their food actually, like we go to supermarkets, they go to the global market and just buy it from there for economics. Next slide, please. But there is one dark side of this story, dark side of this coin, is that green markets become more and more volatile, and volatility is now actually getting to extreme numbers. And some of the reports showing that we are quite for a while in a red zone where volatility reached a point when it becomes really unsustainable. Next slide, please. And if you compare the consumption and production of wheat, for instance, or other main products like corn, this volatility is very clear because consumption and production don't change that rapidly. There is no like bumps or boosts in production or consumption, but there is a lot of booms and busts in prices. Next slide, please. The reason is actually the architecture of what is called global food value chain. And global food value chain is something very often neglected by the competition authorities when they deal with particular markets. Like Andrei was saying that if you go to one single market, one particular market in the national borders of certain vegetables or grain, you see that there's a lot of competition going on there. But this when you see, we have this saying that you don't see the forest behind the trees. So you too much focus on one particular tree, but you don't see how the system operates, how global food value chain operates. And there are many reasons why we don't see it, because it's happening somewhere else, and because the mechanisms are actually below the radars of the authorities when they deal with a particular market. The feature of the global food value chain is that it has two very much concentrated elements, and one which is really dispersed, or one is the most dispersed. And dispersed one is farmers. And farmers actually, as an element of the value chain, they kind of squeezed by these two concentrated nodes of the value chain, and that's where actually all the volatility goes. Actually, where all the cost of volatility goes either to farmers or to consumers. Next slide, please. So we see with this, drops, and one happened just, last week on Friday, enormous drop in prices for wheat, which is not, how to say, related to any of macroeconomic factors. Is just a form of behavior of those concentrated nodes. And one which I will talk a little bit more in my presentation is a node related to trade. Next slide, please. Why it's not, as Stanley was saying, it's not a big concern for developed countries, because essentially in developed countries, and here is an example of European Union, consumers are kind of shielded, protected from this volatility, because you see the line in between, in the middle, which is a price for final product, which goes to the consumer packet, and this is price for bread, and this price is not that volatile as the price for grain and those incoming resources for production of bread. And that's a big deal, because consumers don't see this volatility. This volatility goes either to farmers or developing countries, producers and consumers. Shall we go first? Next slide, please. Further, so global grain trade is essentially a monopoly, is an oligopoly. Sorry, it's pretty much concentrated node with a few companies controlling it. And next slide, please. It happened to a certain extent by design. So it was not so it was not like organic development in any way. There are many reasons, and I have number of stories, and some of the stories in our book, how actually we ended up with such a concentrated node in trade. But one important parameter I want to talk about is financialization. Financialization of value chain actually creates unique opportunities for certain players to collect and aggregate market power incomparable to the market power of others. Next slide, please. In the US and to some extent in Europe, there was a massive deregulation of agricultural derivatives markets, and this derivatives, future contracts, OTC contracts, some of those, they were actually becoming less and less controlled and regulated by financial authorities, which allowed companies like IBM, Bloomberg, Cargill, those global traders to participate in speculative activities on those financial, essentially, markets. Can you go further? Next slide. Yeah. There was a kind of number of discussions on this, and most, active debate was back in 2008, 2009, 2011, when actually the volatility of prices ended up with Arab Springs and actually ousting of the government in Egypt and many other things. Because surge in prices triggered a lot of social consequences. And one of the clear reasons why this volatility happened was actually this futures market and financialization. report was commissioned by G20 to FAO, OECD, IMF, WTO, UNCTAD, names of those a bunch of organizations, and they finally decided, okay, it's very complicated, we don't know what's going on, but it's better to continue our research and thinking. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah. At the same time, like UNCTAD in its development trade and development report was very actually direct, saying that it was essentially speculative activity in the capital market which led to this type of volatility. Next slide, please. And what was actually clear that these guys who became very knowledgeable about what's going on in the market, who know where supply goes, where demand is, where deficit could be, where scarcity, where excessive production, and so on. They became like knowledge kind of traders, or how do you say, brokers. So because they know stuff, they know the whole value chain. And for instance, Cargill is called the chain in itself. This company represents basically the chain. When they know about everything, they can trade much more effectively. Effectively from perspective of profit maximization, not effectively from the perspective of sustainability of the marketplace. In financial markets, as pure financial markets, this type of trading is called inside trading, essentially. If you know something about the company financials and you trade with shares of this company, you consider to be a criminal because it's inside trade. But when you know something about commodity prices and you trade at the same time at the derivative market, which is a huge market of its own, you can't do it. So I'm close to that. Yeah, next slide, please. So financialization essentially created an enormous competition problem, which creates a lot of barriers of entry for small traders, and also enormous asymmetry in information. Go further. Next slide. Yeah, and I'm closing. So what we need, and that was actually even debated by OECD, the Global Competition Forum, is proactive position of the competition authorities from the perspective of global value chain. Next slide, please. We see a lot of market concentration happening there, and some of those having hidden forms, and some joint ventures which totally neglected when we talk about R&D. They go really easily, and authorities don't really go through this or use those, and that's a big issue of this hidden concentration in the market among these traders. And then go further. Next slide, yeah. So, for instance, Kaja was very active, and it's unfortunate Victor is not with us, observing those joint ventures. But actually, this joint venture was cleared by all the global authorities around the world on the basis of innovation as a defense approach. And next slide. And one major which is coming is going to be on your table, competition authorities of the base countries. Be prepared to because I'm not finishing. I'm not finishing. Just the last slide.
But you had slides and they were interesting, so we'll forgive you. And you'll speak again depending on the generosity of your fellow panelists. So I want to move to dinner before we lose all the time. And you want to talk about industrial policy, competition, and trade in food and agriculture. I want you to do that. I don't know if you have slides. You're going to take 10 minutes at once or 5? 8. Okay. Competition authorities are very busy all over the world now, especially the developing countries. We've heard from Egypt, from FAS. I can say South Africa is doing the same, monitoring food prices. Should they be doing this? Is this not an industrial policy issue? Why should competition authorities be price regulators?
Great, I think so. Great question. Thank you for that. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure. In a sense, and maybe I'll start with that until my slides come up, is that for many years, I've been working on competition in developing countries, and I've been somehow waiting for the moment to actually be speaking about competition law in developing countries. So I'm really happy to be here, and I think this is the best audience to have for the kind of stuff that I've been working on for more than a decade. All right, so I'll move quickly through the first couple of slides. What I was hoping to start the discussion with is just a context about food insecurity, raising prices or rising prices. We've been talking about this already all morning. The role of competition and trade, and here I want to ask whether competition and trade law is contributing to the problem that we're facing, or can it be a solution that we can then pair with industrial policy? And in that sense, I'm hoping to then get to Tembi's question as well. So where this is basically situated is that we are facing an enormous amount of food insecurity because of a lot of reasons. We've talked about this already. COVID pandemic, climate change, water shortages, armed conflicts here and there, increasing every day, high levels of inflation, but also a competition and trade policy that I argue are incompatible with the kind of difficulties that our world is facing. So just to contextualize further on the next slide, please. If you look at the rising prices in food, and this is from the IMF, you see that it's not very clear, but the darker the color, the more the inflation is. And you see that most of the countries with the highest level of year-on-year inflation in food prices are situated in the global south. And this is particularly problematic, but in combination to that, if you see on the next slide, we have also rising commodity prices. So it's not just agricultural produce, but we're also here talking about the rise in energy prices, the rise in fertilizers. And we see that maybe it's not at the levels that it was at in the 70s, but we're already reaching enormously high levels in many of these commodities that are, unfortunately, and on the next slide, you see particularly faced in countries in the south. So you see that the countries, these are the 10 countries with the most people facing acute food insecurity. And these are statistics or data from IPC just this August. You see that, again, most of these countries are in the global south. And these are countries that combine that with a lot of other issues that are faced there. Poverty, inequality will just not be something that can be easily overcome. Now, the next slide we can skip through very quickly, but this is just to show that the most are affected are often net importers. And here you see Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Algeria, but also countries in South Asia. They are the most affected by these rising prices because they are the net importers, which gets me to the next part of my talk, is how does competition law and trade policy square with that? I've personally been occupied with the role of free trade and how international organizations have played a role, maybe not directly, but indirectly, in exacerbating these difficult situations faced in much of the global south. So whether it's the WTO or the agreement on agriculture, but the bound tariffs that are set are the first level limitations that many of these countries face. But more than that, the concept of tariff escalation, where you find that countries will use the tariffs to make it more difficult for countries in the south that have the raw materials to be actually processing these raw materials and then exporting these into countries often in the north. So you see that how the tariffs are used to disfavor countries in the south repeatedly happening under the auspices of many of these international organizations. Now, you see that on the one hand, but on the other hand, and this is just, it's not meant to be read, but it's just to show the extent. These are the export bans of many countries over the past year. And you see that many countries have entered into these export bans to, in one sense, protect their national consumption. So many countries find that they don't have sufficient produce to cover their local consumption. So they end up imposing these export bans that then affect other countries, often countries like the net importers that are dependent on the import of wheat and the import of fertilizers and the rice and so on. Now, this is a trade issue that goes hand in hand, and on the next slide you will see goes hand in hand with a competition issue, which is that you see again more and more concentrated markets. And then these are just some of the latest mergers. So over the past maybe 10 years in the food and agriculture, you see that these are huge mergers that have only concentrated the markets further. And I hear we're going to skip over the next one because maybe we're going to come back to it, but already Alexi mentioned the merger, so I'll skip over that. But that's again something that just Reuters a couple of days ago is concluding that this will be finalized in mid-2024. So there is no question mark whether this merger will actually happen or not, knowing that it's still awaiting all the approvals from countries around the world, which is the next slide. And here maybe I'll spend a little bit more time. So this is based on research I did part of my doctoral work, and I completed, or I've been continuing since, with the help of many people here around the room that I've emailed for surveys and data over the years. So what I was collecting here, and that's just a snapshot of a lot of other statistics that I've been working on, is what happens in the developing countries in terms of competition law enforcement. And this is just a snapshot of the merger. And these are countries that have merger regulations. So this is not countries that didn't adopt a merger review mechanism. And you see here the numbers of the yellow dots in the bottom are the numbers of refused mergers. And the rest are numbers of mergers filed, numbers of mergers requested. And you see that systematically countries across the South approve every single merger that comes to be clear, which asks and poses a lot of questions. Is what happened? Why are these mergers systematically approved? And what also a question of accountability. How can developing countries somehow contribute to markets getting more and more concentrated, and whether they actually do have the power to do anything different? So this is a very complicated question that maybe we can come back to in another discussion. Which gets me to the last part of my talk. So what next? Now that the situation will probably only get worse with climate change, continued armed conflicts, heavily relying on imports, more instability here and there, where can we look for a solution? And what I've been working on and trying to articulate from at least a theoretical point of view, maybe less as a practical point of view, and that's on the next slide, is suggestion for what I call an alternative market structure. So what I mean by an alternative market structure is that we should snap out of our obsession with the perfect competition ideal, part of neoclassical economics, and we should think about other ways to do competition law and to think about what our markets should look like. So high there is South-South cooperation. So we need to, not just in trade, but we need to, for example, if mergers need to be stopped and we need to refuse these mergers, then countries in the global South need to coordinate together. Each one on their own will not have the power and the capacity to stop an international global merger on the docket of the authority, but together, maybe something can change. There also needs to be, in a way, what I call here, they need to encourage local production through lax competition policy. So this is here inspired by a little bit what Ajit Singh and Alice Amsden have written about what they call heterodox competition policy. What is meant here is that we need to think, and that has already been mentioned since the morning today, we need to start thinking about competition law as a balance between competition and cooperation. So it's never just competition, but it has to be a way to think about how our markets should look like. We prioritize equity, not efficiency. And we look at other countries for inspiration. And I think Alexi said this also earlier today, is that this is a ripe moment, because if we look around us, this is actually happening. And that's on the very last slide, what I call industrial policy, is that this is happening even in the West today. So if you look at the American rhetoric about America adopting a modern industrial policy, suddenly now we can start talking about industrial policy in the South. So for many years, this has been sort of outcast as the policy not to be spoken. But today, and that's what I mean, we can combine that with competition policy and say, okay, maybe we need to focus on industrialization. And we need to focus on industrialization, but at the same time, not affect the most vulnerable. And this might be complicated because industrialization often means that we're making our markets more concentrated, might mean that prices will go up. And I've written about this a lot, and I don't have time to speak about it here, but there is a way to combine that with what I call an active redistributive mechanism that we can think about through things like what are today fashionable to talk about, the ESG mandates, in a way socializing the firm, embedding it within a wider network that it's responsible for its community, forcing some of that surplus to be redistributed back to the workers, but also to the people buying the products. And in a way, this could fit within a development agenda, or what I also refer to a lot is the South African approach, fitting that within what is referred to as a public interest approach. So it snaps out of the competition obsession with markets, but think about markets in what I call this alternative mechanism. And I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you. Dina, you've also taken your 10 minutes. So you also are dependent on the generosity of your fellow panelists. And we do have two remaining speakers. That's why I'm still on time. So Sachin, you want to talk about agricultural subsidies and trade institutions.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to speak on three components. One is agriculture subsidies, competition, and food security, and how it is linked with each other, and how the trade distortion impact the farm income of poor farmers. Now, if we talk about agriculture subsidies, I'll just give you some of the figures which the international agencies has projected that by 2030, the producer support, global producer support, may be around 1.8 trillion US dollar. And there is another thing in the WTO negotiation when you talk about, there is also talk about that to the flexibility to provide trade distortion subsidies would reach by 2030 would be around 1.5 trillion by 2030. So agriculture subsidies is a big issue. Now let's talk about competition. Now for the competition, there need to be a level playing field. And when we're talking about the level playing field, you see the situation of the farmers in developing and least developing countries. Most of the farmers, they face multiple challenges. They face infrastructure issues, marketing issues, credit issues, and the farm distress. These are some of the important things. And over and above, they face the import surges from the subsidized products coming from the other countries. If I give the one figure, let's talk about the per farmer subsidies or support under the agreement on agriculture, which many of the countries are giving. In many of the rich countries, the per farmer support per annum is more than 60,000 US dollar. And when we talk about least developing country, whether it's the Zambia, whether the Kenya or even Egypt, is around $100 to $200 per annum. So there is a huge difference between this. So agriculture subsidies also have impact on the farm income, and it's not because most of if the rich countries give high level subsidies, it's hamper the competition. It also adversely impact the farm income of poor farmers. And majority of the farmers in least developing country and developing countries are low income or resource poor farmers. I give the India's figure. In India, the average land holding size is just 1.08 hectares. And our 99.45% farmers have land holding less than 10 hectares. And this is not unique situation to the India. You go to the South Africa, you go to Zambia, you go to Kenya or any African country to find this kind of situation. Now let's about the competition. Now there is talk about disciplining the agriculture subsidies in the WTO negotiations. And you will surprised to know that how these rules are made under the WTO. If a rich country give 100% subsidy to rice or corn, then it's allowed. But if India, if Egypt, or if South Africa give more than 10% of value of production, then the rules say that no, you are trade distorting. So rules are not fair at all at the WTO. And we need to change those rules if we're talking about the competition. Then the second thing is that under the WTO, many of the least developing country and developing country can give investment subsidy under the development box. And the type of negotiation at the moment in the WTO going on, this flexibility is trying to cap. So whatever the little support the developing country, least developing country can give, the WTO rules can make these rules in favor of rich farmers and the rich countries. And there is no special and differential treatment we are talking about. And we are not talking about survival of the fittest. It's the survival of the fattest. That's what we are talking about in the WTO negotiation. And the next thing, now come to the food security. How we food security ensure? Let's take the example of India. In India, we have National Food Security Act 2013. The government of India has providing annually 800 million people subsidized food grains, free of food grains. And during the COVID time, India has given these subsidized food grains to the poor people. Just imagine that if in case of India, India had not have the public stocks, and if large country like India had entered in the international market to procure food grains, what will have the implication for the least developing country and the developing countries? And I give the example, in India, we have providing the price support, and it's not unique. In Indonesia, Zambia, Kenya, there are so many countries, even China, there are so many countries who are giving the price support. Even Egypt is also giving this price support. And if I talk about the rules, you will surprise, you will start laughing. What's the rules? I can take the case of the Egypt. In the case of Egypt, if a farmers is getting a price support of $5 only for 1 ton, 1,000 kg, if you're getting more than $5, then we called it subsidies. From where in this world, in $5, you can get 1,000 kg of wheat? I don't know where, but these rules are there. And we need to change these rules. We need to protect the interests of the farmers. We also have to see that we ensure the food security of the poor and the vulnerable section of the society. And I will say one thing, that one can't tread the path of trade on an empty stomach. And we need to have public stockholding programs. We need to protect the low income and social poor farmers. And if we're talking about competition, first of all, let's have level playing field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You kept within time. You squandered well 10 minutes. It's good. Yeah. And you did well. And then we are going to go to Claudia. Claudia is joining us. Please, I hope you've been listening to the discussion, and your topic is quite broad. So you can decide whether you want to take all your 10 minutes since you are online, or you want to be more engaged in the debate, in which case you can take 5 or a little bit more than that.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And I was too also more quite ambitious in preparing my slides that I'm going to share in a moment with you. I hope you can see my slides now on the screen. Can you? I hope you can see. So what I'm going to do is to focus on a specific type of global value chain, which is the ICT global value chain, and in particular focusing on data ownership and its effects and impact on both social and environmental sustainability. So again, I've been probably a little bit too ambitious in preparing the slides, so I will have to lift or skim through them. But hopefully this will make sense, especially for this panel. And I think it can complement quite well what has been said so far. So what I would like to do is to focus, as I said a moment ago, on ICT in global agricultural value chains. And because there has been a lot of rhetoric, and not only rhetoric, but focus in particular on the positive aspects of ICT in global value chains, in particular highlighting that data-driven agriculture can enable more sustainable farming practices and more efficient farming practices. And this is absolutely true because it's been boasted by a number of studies and empirical studies as well. And what do we talk about though when we talk about farm data, in particular agricultural data, is mostly by the literature divided into 3 different types of data. It can be farm data that is collected by using farm sensors and machines or directly by farmers. Complementary data that includes weather, satellite, and other environmental data, and proprietary data that that consists of performance information, mostly gathered by agricultural inputs producers. Now, the governments and international organizations have mostly focused on the potential or on the potential positive effects that these high precision agriculture can have on both social and environmental sustainability, and we have seen that they have also started investing heavily in this field in terms of actual investments, but also in terms of regulation. We see both international and regional and local regulation going indeed in this direction. We can mention some, for example, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the Camden Declaration, the Cartagena Protocol, but also, for example, at regional level, the EU Common Agricultural Policy. They all emphasize the same principles. However, let's take a quick look at what's happening actually at market level and what this might mean for the development of this sector at global level. So we know that from the limited data that we have at the moment, that input producers such as Bayer, BASF, and Dow DuPont have access to large proprietary data, and actually through both vertical integration and specific agreement with third party, they have also acquired large amounts of third-party data. There is a certain amount of potentiality for tech giants such as Amazon, Microsoft, and Cisco Systems to enter this sector. However, at the moment, they apparently have only a very small share of these markets. The remaining part being owned by machinery producers, in particular John Deere, who has invested mostly though on a very specific segment of this market data. Now, what does it mean for global markets and developing economies in particular? Well, for global markets, it means that there is a problem of data ownership and fragmentation of this data, because as we've seen, there are 3 main types of data. Only some of these players are able to combine these data silos together. For the global economy, this means also that this data is not only concentrated in certain industries, but also in certain parts of the world, thus putting at a disadvantage, in particular, the developing economies that, according to some two UN studies, they often already nowadays contribute only to low-value work to the global data economy, in particular in the agricultural sector. For example, contributing only to labeling tasks. And let's take a better look, though, at what can be the consequence for global markets, in particular in the agricultural sector. Because according to some meta studies, the primary objective of data owners in using their data is apparently about increasing production. And the same findings actually can be found in the competition law case of the DG Comp in Europe in the merger Bayer and Monsanto, where where the Director General of Competition, the European Commission, advanced the same warning, saying that the input producers may want to either prevent or slow the or actually reverse the effects of some of the efficiency effects of high precision agriculture, namely the reduction in use of inputs as one of the efficiencies, right? Because they are selling these inputs. So what other problems are visible here from an antitrust perspective? Well, first and foremost, these negative impact on sustainability, social and environmental sustainability may be the result of abuses of power. However, we don't have enough evidence, that's why the question mark, to really to flesh out a full-fledged theory of harm here. That's why I have here different hypotheses. One of them could be a refusal to deal if any other third party requires access to this bundled data. However, at least according to EU competition law, farmers do not seem to be able to request access based on the case law that we have in Europe at the moment. Third parties instead might be able to do so. For example, third parties that want to train algorithms in order to provide services that are either in competition or in a different market from the one of the data owner. Other possible theories of harm are tying and bundling, exclusionary effect of data combination, degradation of quality, lock-in, and high switching costs. And last but not least, probably the issue that more easily could be provision that more easily could be triggered by farmers could be the one on abuse of economic or superior bargaining power, in particular from the perspective of abuse of economic dependence or technological dependence. However, unfortunately, I don't think I have time to linger on these points any further. So please, I will just conclude here. What I wanted to say today is that there is a disparity in value creation generated by this concentration in data ownership in high precision agriculture. This can only be exacerbated over time given the trends that we are observing today. And this imbalance, or this results also in an imbalance in power distribution that seems to suggest that the sustainability objectives set by the law will only be reversed or anyway prevented by these by the misaligned incentives that we observe in this very highly concentrated industry. Hopefully, I didn't use too much of my time, and I managed to go through all my slides anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These have all been very interesting presentations, and you've taken your 10 minutes. But what I suggest we do now, I'm going to give priority now to the audience. If anyone has like a burning question, just raise your hand. Otherwise, we're going to continue with the debate here on the podium.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for that interesting discussion, though I missed a majority portion of it because I had to take a call. But being a very novice question, what's the impact of global... Oh, sorry. I'm Rahul Banerjee. I'm the managing director at Rice in House. We are a policy research think tank with the Ministry of External Affairs. A very novice question for the panel, whoever wants to answer. What is the impact of geopolitical competitions, especially right now, on domestic market competition, especially related to food prices?
Thank you. Maybe we'll take your question, Teresa, as well, and then we'll come back.
Thank you. Well, I'm Teresa Moreira. It's more of a comment. Thank you also very much for the presentations. I think this is a very, very important issue. And I have to say that some years ago, Alexei and Yanis Lianos were the ones that, from my point of view, really identified this as a key issue from a point of view of competition law and policy, namely taking into consideration developing countries' interests. And it's deserved that you get the credit because, frankly, it's the first research that I came across. But I wanted just to mention that because UNCTAD, my organization, as I mentioned, deals with international trade and development and is focused on assisting developing countries, we have been working, we meaning not the competition and consumer policies branch, but colleagues from my division, which encompasses the commodities branch, the trading systems and the trade agreements branch, to a point that at the end of 2020, we made a pledge on the right to food of citizens of developing countries. So this has been very much on the agenda, of course, not necessarily from a competition law and policy point of view, but I think it's really something very interesting and timely. And it was because of our work to the UN Global Crisis Response Group that we analyzed the impacts on food, on energy, and of course on financing for development. I also want to say that in any case, this connection between trade and competition goes back to, and I look at Dr. Sharma, to the, of course, WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the working group that as of 96 was created to explore the links between trade and competition in order to maybe explore some sort of multilateral rules, binding rules on competition. And we know that it will be 20 years next year, that because of developing countries, but trade ministers of developing countries, that this topic was dropped. I think increasingly in Geneva, because it is the international trade hub, we have been hearing more references to trade and competition. But there are so many other priorities, like with the e-commerce, like, of course, with agriculture, like with the agendas for upcoming ministerial meetings that we are not here yet. But, and I will end here, I just wanted to mention that this really makes a very strong case to the need that I think we all share, the need of really having a combination of public policies. So putting problems, challenges, issues, solutions in the wider context, both for developing and developing countries. And tell me, if last year the OECD might not be interested in food, this year all European countries were very seriously hit by the hikes of food prices. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I don't want to say I'm glad, but I think it's a good direction. You have to promise that you're going to go straight for your question, otherwise we
Exactly.
I still owe people some time.
Alan Asher from Fairer Future. To what extent are humanitarian supplied food aid to countries like Egypt, in other words, very cheap wheat and things like that, part of the problem because of the impact that that has on domestic production?
Short and sweet.
Sorry.
Next one.
May I?
Thank you.
May I? Very quick. 10 minutes is possible to speak 10 minutes? A little more? No,
Do you want to be kicked out?
No, very quick. So, Ettore Lombardi from Italy. So, very quickly, I would like to ask you, in general, we spoke about trade competition, speaking about sustainability. Before Teresa spoke about new trends and so forth. Sorry if I called you Teresa. I consider you as a colleague. What I would like to know is what is your idea regarding, for example, the food created in laboratory, the insects that are used for wheat, or the cultivated meat. So what is the impact of these new ideas, trends, I don't know how to call it. For sure, I won't eat these kind of things for sure. But is it possible that there is an alteration on competition and trade? And is it possible that we will have a world divided in two zones? The zone A, where the food is very high quality and good, and the zone B, where the food is less nice and probably packed in a nice way, but not very healthy and good. Thank you.
Let's leave it there on that note about insects. So you all have questions. What I suggest we do, you're gonna all have a chance to address the questions, but I do owe all of you who wanted to make comments on measures. So I want to start with that and then come back to these questions. Competition authorities, you have your 5 minutes that you had reserved. I don't know who wants to go first. There has been a challenge already that's been placed about by Dina on the effectiveness of measure regulation, given that she says almost all measures were approved. And did you want to pose a question on measures, Alexei? Maybe if you did, you could now. I said I had you challenging the competition authorities.
A question from me would be very simple to competition authorities, whether they can really use GVC, global food value chain, global value chain methodology for reviewing this merger, or it would also like escape and get like easy treatment. Like whether this methodology is possible these days, and how preparation is a key, I think. So my question is how section F actually, which was quite actively elaborated on at UNCTAD recently. I mean, section F of UN set of principles. It should work. It should start working. Why wouldn't we trigger it in this particular case? So two questions: GVC and section F preparation. Two authorities.
And other members of the panel wanted to talk about measures? No? Okay, let's get to the competition authorities then.
Yes, talking about measures, I'd like to stress one very important thing from my point of view, and went back to on 6 or 7 years ago, when we started the first food and agriculture report of BRICS working group on food. Made actually by Future, at that time BRICS Competition Law and Policy Center, but people who then became the members of the center. From my point of view, the most important outcome of this report was that mergers in traditional sectors like agriculture are not be estimated and examined in traditional way, because even in these sectors, any merger, any acquisition, any combination or concentration goes together with the process of digitalization and globalization. First outcome is that it is nearly impossible to make good, right, and effective and implementing decision in one country by one and only competition authorities, because everything is global. Second, very important outcome, for instance, for Russian competition authority, for the FOS, because we used these results of BRICS Competition Center report in our practical enforcement. For instance, in Bayer Monsanto case, it's not about seeds. It's about big data. It's about new technologies. It's about huge amount of knowledge and about huge amount of money invested in this knowledge. And cooperation of big owners of knowledge, data, experience that can manipulate behavior both of farmers and final consumers is very important. Is very important, and we couldn't ignore it during the examination of merger cases and during the making decision on this. That's from my point of view the most important part of new approach to mergers and acquisition examination, and it should be implemented in practical life. And I think that's the answer for Alexei's question as well.
Yes, Egypt.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have much to say because, as most of you know, we didn't have merger control regime since I don't know when. But happily, the good news, December 2022, the parliament approved the new merger regime. Now it's not a full happy story yet, but because we need to wait for the executive regulations to come out. But we're currently utilizing another platform, which is the COMESA Competition Commission. Being part of COMESA Competition Commission means that we have a regional body that needs to look into mergers. And actually, there is a very good collaboration and cooperation between our agency and COMESA. And we do investigate the impacts into local markets for COMESA. So this is part of our take. And we also didn't stop there. To be very frank, we currently working also closely with a couple of ministries. So for example, the Ministry of Health, we have an agreement or a cooperation, you name it, that any merger acquisition happening within the healthcare sector, i.e. hospitals, medical devices, medicine, and so on, they would not approve it until they take our opinion on this matter. So that's why we try to use an unorthodox way of moving around until we have the regime operating. And that's why also I think what we've heard there, I think it's making it very interesting, for example, in these major cases, to look into regional efforts, and maybe afterwards, now with the Continental African Free Trade Area and having a competition agency, that would be a much powerful tool to look into these matters in a very effective way. And collaboration and cooperation between competition agency until we achieve this level is crucial to look into these cases that would not impact one country, but rather would impact most of these countries in the south. Thank you.
Thank you. We now are at open time for these questions that were asked. Maybe we should start online because there's always a risk of getting cut off. Brother, do you want to address any of the questions? I was interested, actually. I was going to ask you about what do you suggest should be done? I mean, you left a few questions about theories of harm. It looks like the train is moving and it's almost inevitable that this data from precision agriculture is going to be used. Do you have any solutions? I know academics are not always good at this. do you have any solutions for us, ordinary people?
Yeah, so it's true. We love theories, but we very often don't find them rooted into practical solution. But yes, so a first part of the solution, I believe, is, and this is my academic soul saying that, is developing more knowledge about these markets. So studying. So one of the main problems at the moment is that we don't have enough information about these markets, and so most is left to data that has been gathered in just a couple of cases that didn't even have these agricultural data as a main focus. However, that being said, more can be done from the competition law perspective, first and foremost by prioritizing enforcement in these areas, exactly because of the exacerbation of issues that might not seem to be at first blush as so directly related to competition law enforcement, such as the negative impacts on social and environmental sustainability, but that are the result of an abuse of dominance anyway. So I'm referring, for example, to a refusal to deal that might, for example, that might result in a less efficient utilization of resources that thus leads to an increase in use of inputs, for example, of production, seeds or pesticides, right? So if this abuse of dominance leads to these results, then we can assume that it could be prioritized by antitrust authorities, not only on the basis of the fact that it's a possible abuse of dominance, but also because it prevents the government from reaching these sustainability goals. So, but then also all the other theories of harm could be used. Another thing that we haven't seen yet is how these problems could be prevented or could be counteracted to a certain extent by ex-ante regulation. So there has been a lot of research on data access. However, data access has limited use when it comes to preventing the problems that I don't want to re-summarize them, but all the problems that I mentioned in my presentation. So what about instead of utilizing DMA-like, for example, solutions? This could be an idea to prevent abuses of power related to these high concentration of data sets in the hands of really a handful of players. And last but not least, abuse of superior bargaining power, that though we find in very few countries when it comes to, in particular, abuse of technological dependence.
Great, thank you. I like that solutions mandated approach. We're gonna have to also close here, so I'm gonna give you a chance to answer the questions and say your last word, Tina, first. I actually did want to ask you as well about, what you think is the instrument. There's a lot of talk about competition and obviously competition authorities. There's also talk about trade. And I have this question: what instrument should be used? Of course, please do, if you would like to answer all the questions that were asked from the audience.
So I think I limit myself to the question that you also asked me earlier. And I think it relates to the instrument question in the sense that should competition authority be actually monitoring the prices? Should they be involved in price setting? And I think yes. So I think my answer is yes. And it's because of the things I said, is I don't think we can disentangle on the one hand trade and on the other hand competition policy from an overarching development policy, industrial policy, or public interest orientation. I think it all fits together. And I think that in my opinion, and I'm always criticized by people who say, well, competition law is about competition and about markets. And I think since it's a regulation about organizing the market, it's so malleable that it can be about everything else as well. So I think it just needs to, you can frame it whatever, you can call it consumer welfare, you can call it equity, you can call it public interest. I think the broader our terms is, the more we're giving these authorities the instruments to address what it is that they want to address. And I think in the global south and developing countries, what we need to address are issues around poverty, about access, about exclusion, about free distribution. And all these things can be addressed through competition law, whether we look at it from a merger perspective, active enforcement against international, multinational mergers that affect the markets, but maybe sometimes sheltering local mergers that will have export potential. So there has to always be a balance. Sometimes I call it selective enforcement. So there has to be this balance that these competition authorities basically have the tools to organize the market, and in organizing the market, they can do all of that. Let's stop here.
Maybe it's logical that we come to you, Dr. Sharma. What, you can answer the questions, of course, but I'm interested on, you say this problem must be solved. Who must solve it?
See that if you're talking about my intervention about what is the problem need to be solved, the specific thing what I was talking about, the WTO rules need to be changed and who will solve is all the countries who are facing the constraint to support their farmers or ensuring the food security. And that's why more than 80 countries had tabled a proposal, including South Africa, at the WTO for a permanent solution for the food security. So we countries come together and need to change to make trade in real sense fair. And about, yes, shall I talk about, yeah, there are two specific questions were there. I think if I get it correctly, one was that impact of geopolitical tension on the international food prices, on the domestic prices, if I am right. So yes, it was a huge impact on the domestic prices, not only in India, but many other countries as well. There are few slides were there where Argentina prices have increased. There are a lot of other countries already we mentioned, because already the through trade, the whole agriculture markets are interrelated, they are integrated. So it has implications in the one country's trade measure or sport measure has implication in other countries as well. The second question was about the Egypt. Shall I give answer? Okay. The answer was that the question was that whether how the cheap food has impact on the farm income of Egypt. So there are two things are there. There are many countries who are net food importing countries. They are importing food grains, but they also, if you see the agriculture policy of this country, they also wanted to some extent the self-sufficiency in the food production as well. So for this, when there may be an impact of the food when we are importing it, but to support the farmers, that's why the countries are implementing different kind of support measures, including price support. And that's what the Egypt government are also giving the price support. They are implementing, they announce a target price, and to shield the farmers from the losses, they are procuring from the farmers to help them. And also through other measures like general services, infrastructure, and besides trade measure also. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Egypt is here.
No, actually, it's correct. I mean, what have been said. No, I'm interested actually on the insect part.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So actually, 15 years ago, when one can tell me that Egyptians, for example, would eat imported meat, I would not. It was not accepted. People feel that this is great kind of thing. I want to eat local meats and also chicken, for example. Looking into it in a way, frozen chicken was not accepted. But after swine flu, everybody was forced to eat kind of frozen chicken. So from this experience, I would say it might happen. clearly. So maybe now we're saying that, but maybe after 15, 20 years, that would be not the case. And again, I mean, when we talk about importation, I think in Egypt, I would say, we like it or not, we'll still be importing grains because the amount of population increase is still continuing, and the amount of water and is limited, and hence we can satisfy a portion, but not 100% at all. So we will always still be importing, and that's why going back to the fluctuation of prices, actually the Egyptian government suffered around 12 billion Egyptian pounds difference between the price of wheat that have been purchased prior to the war and post the war. And hence, this was not applied to consumers because, for example, bread is subsidized. So it was absorbed within the government budget. Hence, the government budget would be limited to put investment in other parts of the economy. Hence, I think this is a ripple effect that everyone can understand. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me now turn to the Russians. I'll start with you, Andre. You can answer any of these questions, of course. But I found it interesting that you were talking about the establishment of these commodities exchanges. And Alexei, on the other hand, was critical of the financialization of these markets. Sounds like a contradiction to me. We have this we have these commodities trading platforms in South Africa, and they tend to use a kind of pricing models that are somewhat artificial, like import parity price. You know, you could have a surplus of grain, but they're still going to use the international price for that. How do you resolve this problem in an exchange environment?
Thank you for your question. And you just mentioned the answer. The idea is to unbundle the local prices from the world prices on the same commodities, because now the Russian market in such a strange situation, yes, that is partly separated from the world market, and we strictly need for local price indices and special forms of maintaining and calculating the fair price on the local market of Russia. And that's one of the reasons why we in the process of development of the exchange trade in our country. And it seems to me that it's not a contradiction, because a lot of things are depending on the rules of trade on exchange. And as Alexei talked, that the situation of financialization and of the exchange trade in the United States, for instance, partly is a result of the rules of trade on this market. It part is the result of lack of control from the side of governmental authorities responsible for financial market functions on the situation.
Thank you. I'm still suspicious of these trading platforms. How can you have a trading platform without traders? How can you have traders without speculation? We have to move on.
We have traders, we have producers, we have intermediaries, we have dealers, we have normal structure of internal market in Russia. All participants necessary for normal functionings of exchange trade.
You don't like financialization, so I think you can respond to this. And of course, any other question you want to from the floor. But you were one of the prime movers for us focusing on this topic. What's next?
Thank you, Timby. And if you allow me like 30 seconds to follow up what Andrei was saying, I think that nuances do matter in the way how you design exchanges, how you design this type of training platforms. And it's interesting that in the food sector, we still, have a kind of market organized on the basis of the principles of the 19th century kind of, style of trade. There is a lot of manipulation, which are kind of financial innovations of the 21st century. So it's like a marriage of the two sort of worse features of two worlds. Sort of, they took the worst from the traditional kind of commodity trade back in 19th century and added, modern, super fancy things like derivative contracts and, all the speculative mechanisms. And they didn't try to make it really sustainable and balanced. So that's why, but these markets, this kind of financial platforms they use, Chicago, Paris-based platforms, they super dominant in the global trade. Like we trade wheat from port of Novorossiysk to Alexandria, and we use the base as a basis, Chicago price. I mean, how reasonable is this? And the reason is because this market is hugely globalized, and this is a reply to a question of the gentleman who works for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if I understood correctly, or something related to this ministry. Globalization has an enormous impact now on food production, and it comes from several, domains, and one of those is actually this financialization, globalization of trade as such, because it became like interesting area for financial capital accumulation. But another parameter, another domain is actually what Ettore was asking about insects and new technologies. We are living in a world of really biotechnology produced food. So we're already there. So most of the food on our plates, on our tables, are biotechnology kind of related products, with enormous influence of green revolution happened back in the 60s. And then there were it was evolving. We reached to the point when it is actually other forms of production less sustainable. And I think many of the countries and region-wise, like many of the social groups, they do live in the constant malnutrition type of, manner. So they do get calories, but they don't get all the nutrients necessary, like vitamins and so on. They don't really have diversity. They don't have really a taste. And actually, not only and even not mostly developing countries. It's interesting that if you take like super developed countries like United States, they have terrible vegetables like there is a very nice book called Tomato Land about how monopolies in production of vegetables like tomato who monopolized the market of tomato production and distribution in the United States, really degraded the quality of the vegetables. So back in the 60s, you had like nice tomatoes, several varieties, very good taste and so on. And now it's impossible to eat. I mean, it's like plastic. And the reason is market concentration and technological advance, which makes it cheaper. But this is kind of unsustainable, one-sided type of development. So they developed technology which increased productivity, yields, and stuff, but didn't really invest in other, qualities. And because of the monopolistic market power they had, they enjoyed, they managed to basically, persuade people to buy this tomato. It's actually it's a form of manipulation, like nudging slowly but steadily, and people found themselves. There was a generation of Americans who don't know how tomato tastes, properly. They don't, and as they don't know it, they're not interested. So, and only coming to developing countries, I know some of the countries in the Middle East, we had actually this discussion back in the restaurant in Moscow about Uganda's quality of food. And you were saying like in vegetables in Uganda tasty, which is like very different from what many advanced markets have. So I do think this technology is one of the parameters which does change markets, and markets are transformed under these technological advances and changes. But in many instances, they transform into worse conditions than they were before, economically wise better, and giving more profits to the producers and distributors, but consumer wise, I mean, they would be left. That's where the role of competition authorities would be, very important. Think about sustainable development of the market, sustainable development of technological advances. And that was very clear in the Diamond-Santa case when competition authorities for the first time started to debate how innovation would be organized after the merger. Because merger led to the lack of diversity in innovation processes. So innovation was less diverse, and so farmers became dependent on a single type product. So of certain certain vision about seeds, about agrochemicals, and so on. So I think when authorities start to think more about diversity in a way technology develops, in a way innovation evolves, in the way consumers are served, and really embraces diversity and sustainable development goals, that will be much better world where we don't be forced to eat insects, because our planet can feed us all. I mean, we just don't use our resources properly. We don't, and to a certain extent, we don't actually distribute them properly. So we have enough land and resources to feed ourselves, but there is a lot of benefits out of bottlenecks and shortcomings. And the shortcomings and bottlenecks are heavily utilized by those who have market power because they're interested in the existence of those bottlenecks. So that's our work, our job, competition authorities, to overcome this.
Ladies and gentlemen, this topic can never end. And I think there are various platforms to take it forward. Teresa, by the way, UNCTAD is also quite important for these type of debates, and I know that you've been promoting that. So I think we're looking forward to continuously engage. It's been a terrific panel. Please give them a round of applause.